I'm Jennifer Nish. I'm an assistant professor of rhetoric and composition here at AUB. And I'm chairing the panel today on visual cultures of comic art. So our first speaker will be Sarah Shaker, and she's coming to us from the British University in Egypt. And her panel title is Egyptian Adult Comics, A Place for Untold Gender Stories in Egyptian Society.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. So my presentation is titled Egyptian Adult Comics, A Place for Untold Gender Stories in Egyptian Society. In Egypt, storytelling is often conditioned by the current political climate, particularly after the 25th January in 2011 and the 30th of June in 2013. Thus, it is vital to create and sustain spaces that engage with storytelling, highlighting the sexual imaginaries of Egyptian women, feminists, and activists. But why comics? Why comic books? As a medium, comics are older than films, televisions, and video games. Yet there has been resistance from the academic community to study them as a coherent medium. There are only two scholarly works that have highlighted خلاص كده أنا المايك بيوترني. Okay. So as we were saying, why study comic books? As a medium, comics are older than television, video games, and film. Yet there has been resistance from the academic community to study them as a coherent medium. In Egypt, the only two famous scholarly work on Egyptian comics or Arab comics in general are two things. The first one is an article that has been written by a professor in culture from the University of Oslo called Jacob Hogelt, and this was done in 2017. And the other one was a very important book called Arab Comic Strips that got published in 1994 by Douglas and Douglas. At the same time, comics are not exposed to a continuous process of filtering and editing. And it's highly important to say that particularly in Egypt, comics are not regulated by a supervisory official body. And it's always the decision of the reader to decide at when to flick the pages and when to decide to turn to the other page. But why Egypt? Comics reflect heated discussions, particularly about taboo issues such as women's sexuality. And the uproar that took place, particularly in one of the very famous bookstores in Egypt, which is Shuru, was for about a story titled The Skin in the second issue of Tuk Tuk comic magazine. And Tuk Tuk is a comic magazine that is very famous in Egypt that got published particularly after the 25th January 2011. And it's famous for the diverse artists it brings from across the Arab world. And this story titled The Skin, it was in the second issue of Tuk Tuk that was done by a very male prominent artist called Makhlouf. And this story revolves about a guy named Ibrahim who wants to have sexual intercourse with his wife, but the wife keeps insisting on wearing lipstick that the husband does not like the taste of it. So what happens in this story? The guy refers back to his friends, whereby, what should I do? Should I keep trying? Or should I kill her? What should I do? And eventually he gave up on his wife, and this is when we had a very huge incident in El Shuruk bookstore for a mother yelling at the desk cashier, asking the guy not to sell this comic magazine anymore. And this was the particular aim, or this was the uproar that made me decide, why are comics so neglected in Egypt, even though they discuss very important things? It is important to highlight that adult comics in Egypt did not only start with the publication of Tuk Tuk in 2011. Actually, the first landmark of a comic magazine, or as we say in Egypt, the first graphic novel that was highly important in Egypt was the graphic novel of Metro that was published by Majdi Shafi'i. And this graphic novel was famous for criticizing the injustice faced by the Egyptian, particularly from the Ministry of Interior. During the same time, we had a very prominent online comic in 2008 that was called El Khen, and El Khen was criticizing the current stability discourse that was offered by President Mubarak. And with the outbreak of the 25th, we had the launching of two very famous comic magazines, which are, as I said before, Tuk Tuk, and then we had a very famous one that came in 2014 under the auspices of Nazra feminist organization in Egypt, which is called El Shakmagaya. And El Shakmagaya in English, it basically means the jewelry box. And in this presentation, I selected two particular stories, one from Tuk Tuk and the other one from the Shakmagaya. However, I'm going to start with the first one from El Shakmagaya. This story was done by a comic writer called Muhammad Ismail, and the artist was called Hisham Rahma. And this is a story that was published in El Shakmagaya in 2014, and in Arabic it's titled Nuss al-Tariq, and in English it's called Halfway Through. The story of this comic starts by the broadcasting of the funeral of the last man who was exterminated by a particular virus called the Y2H1. And as we will see throughout this story, the story consists only of female characters. There are no male characters in this story. And the female characters consists of, the main characters are Ulfat, Zainab, the tuk-tuk driver, and the female representatives of the Somali delegation, with a character called Zainab driving in the tuk-tuk with Ulfat in order to pick the Somali delegation from the airport. Do you know what is a tuk-tuk? Everyone knows what's a tuk-tuk? Okay, a tuk-tuk, it's a very small vehicle of a way of transportation, particularly for Egyptians in Cairo, and it's a very small one, and it's similar to the one that is used in India. Okay. Once picking the Somali delegation from the airport, they ask Ulfat and Zainab to take them to Dr. Reem's laboratory, whereby this virus that was developed to exterminate men was created. While going through, they had to stop inside downtown Cairo. And of course, downtown Cairo is famous particularly during the event of the 25th January about the collective rape that happened during that time. Once arriving at Talat Harb, and Talat Harb is a very famous street in downtown Cairo, the street vendors start to harass the Somali delegation. But why I'm telling you all this story, and what is the purpose of this story, and why did I selected it? When analyzing this story, it's very important to highlight that the story narrates the concept of hegemonic masculinity in our patriarchal societies. The term, which is coined by the Australian sociologist Connell, highlights that different cultures ascribe qualities to men that assert their dominance over women, including, for instance, physical strength, or giving them jobs that are usually characterized by having male-dominated jobs, such as, for instance, the tuk-tuk driver, the president, or the medical doctors. While seeing this story at first glance, it seems that both the comic artist tries to challenge the notion of fixed femininity and giving women characteristics that are usually perceived for males or for men. However, both the writer and the artist failed to challenge the binaries of both femininities and masculinities, and shifted the attention from the focus of the sexual violence, failing to take into account masculinities that do not fall under hegemonic masculinities, or that they are actually reproduced in daily life. As Farha Ghanem argues, When people think of gender issues in the Middle East, they usually think of women and how women are always oppressed by men. Yet, one can examine how different elements like class intersect with gender, exploring how many men are oppressed, whether economically, socially, or politically. This comic story reproduces the notion that class oppression is correlated with high perpetrators of violence by bringing in masculine-looking women. However, what we can see is that instead, gender fluidity is caricatured and the gender roles remain fixed with no change. Yet, when interviewing the comic artists, particularly Hisham Rahma, I asked him, why did you particularly decide to present this story in this format? And why the particular masculine look of the woman? What he said is that the script has been sent by him to the writer, and that he imagined that this is how he would do the story. He asserted that unlike caricature, which usually has an implicit message through its illustrations, comics are more based on narrations where artists are able to project their own opinions. However, I didn't stop at this point, and I decided to interview the editor-in-chief of Al-Shakmagiyya. And the editor-in-chief, Fatma Mansour, highlighted that, still the previous one, it's okay. Highlighted that before Hisham Rahma and Muhammad Ismail did this story, they were actually provided gender-related awareness seminars about women's sexuality and gender sexuality. And a very interesting narrative that she highlighted with me during the interview is that one of them started to follow women's squash sport in Cairo. And then I inquired, both in Al-Shakmagiyya and Tuk-Tuk, there is a very high lack of women comic artists whereby we can see a projection of women's opinion. However, all of them elaborated that both magazines are open to all artists from the Arab world. And a very interesting story that was highlighted in Tuk-Tuk is a story called in Arabic Shuk, and in English it's called Thistles. And this was in the issue in Tuk-Tuk about sexual violence against women. And this was done by a very prominent Algerian female artist called Dream. And this story is very intriguing for me because she highlights rape culture in a different way. She highlights that rape culture can actually be challenged. And victims or perpetrators are not represented in the stereotype format. When we see comic magazines or we see comic books, they usually reinforce the idea of rape, ignoring that sexual assault can actually take place with no overt physical force. The story does not only challenge rape culture and patriarchal cultures, but it also challenges the misinformed notions about sex and consent. It dismisses rape as unrelated incident perpetuated by those who are unstable, stigmatizing in terms of mental health, but also shows that sexual violence is systematic and can happen in one's own community. Yet, when looking for women comic artists, particularly in Egypt, Fatma Mansour, who's the editor-in-chief of Al-Shakmagiyya, Muhammad al-Shinawi, the main founder of Tuk-Tuk, and Hisham Rahma, one of the founders of Tuk-Tuk as well, highlight that it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And according to Fatma Mansour, particularly Fatma Mansour, she highlights that women comic artists are really hard to find in Egypt because it involves improvisation outside of the conventional narrative. And women are still shy in expressing themselves compared to men because of the societal pressure they face, assigning them particular gender role. While artists, particularly male artists, try not to present comic stories or to do comic magazines that result in a hyper-masculine character or a hyper-sexualized female characters performing acts of sexualities, unfortunately, they overlook masculinities that are actualized and reproduced in daily life. Thank you very much.
Is this a weird buzzing sound in the room, or am I imagining? Is there like a weird buzz, like a hum?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, can that be like fixed, or it's normal? في صوت وشة عادي يعني؟ Oh,
مش
could that be like involved? Okay.
Watch out بس for the watch out for the wires.
Trapeze. Okay. Can you move?
Oh, sure.
So our second speaker is Hind Al-Awadi, and she's from the University of Rochester. And her paper today is called Killing Joy, Making Space, The Feminist Politics of Comics Killjoy.
Thank you. How do I slideshow?
I believe you can click on for that.
Thanks. I actually didn't update the organizers between applying and getting here. I actually graduated and I got a job at KU, so my affiliation is slightly different. Thank you. Okay. All right. In the summer of 2017, Shubbak, London's largest biennial festival of contemporary Arab culture, held its 4th edition. One of the exhibits organized was held at the British Library, titled Comics and Cartoon Art from the Arab World. A testament to the enduring history and increasing proliferation of the medium, the exhibit featured many important classics from the Arab-speaking world, such as children's magazines like Sinbad and Samir, and collectively produced publications like Tuk Tuk and Samandal, which is coming out of Lebanon. Works by political cartoonists and illustrators were also on display, spanning a period from the 19th century to the present. And the earliest of these were by James Sanwa, who was active in the mid-19th century. Sanwa, who's also known as Yaqub Sannu', was an Egyptian Jewish dramatist and journalist working under the pen name Abu Naddara, which is not to be confused with the contemporary Syrian film collective Abu Naddara. And he published his own newspapers in Cairo and continued to work whilst in exile in Paris. They also included works by Alexander Sarukhan, who published Sept Guerres in 1945, and of course Naji Ali's work was there, which I'm sure most of you know. They had Palestine al-Thawra there. And Mazen Kirbaj's work, who documented the Israeli aerial bombardment of Beirut through his graphic memoir Beirut Jouer Août. Ben Youssef Abbas Kabir, who published 17 Poules, Tragédie sur scène, and Islam Gawish, whose online comic Al Waraqa has now, and it's a Facebook, and then he then published it in print. He has over 2 million followers on Facebook. That was also on display. Yet missing from this illustrious list of artists were important contributions by female authors, specifically works produced post-Arab Spring. The two exceptions there were Nadia Khiariz Willis from Tunis, Chronique de la Révolution, sorry, my French is not so great, and Al-Shayma Hamed's and Maikrem's حين تخلت الآلهة عن كفافس. Graphic novels such as Zaina Abi Rashid's A Game for Swallows, To Die, To Leave, To Return, Leila Abdurrazzaq's Baddawi, and webcomics such as Dina Muhammad's Qahira and Maya Al-Hulus Kharabish Nasawiya were not included. Although the exhibit was small and by no means exhaustive, feminist approaches to the medium were noticeably absent. In an attempt to shift the focus towards the often underrepresented perspectives of female and feminist authors, especially within the medium of comics and graphic novels, I examine in this paper the popular webcomic Kharabish Nasawiya, which you see on the screen right now, focusing specifically on the presence of the feminist killjoy, a concept coined by feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed in 2012. Created by the Beirut-based artist Maya El-Hulu in the summer of 2016, Kharabish Nasawiya, also known as Comics Killjoy, is distributed among several social media channels, including a Facebook page that has already more than 15,000 likes. And I had to update this number every time I revise this draft. It keeps increasing by 1,000 every week or so. El-Hulu repurposes pop art images found on the internet, often featuring variations of the melodramatic damsel in distress theme, and superimposes them with feminist messages in Arabic. The type of images used are similar to the ones that pop artist Roy Lichtenstein used and other artists, but unlike them, the reworking of the image here is his reworking of the image was usually about the text itself, like he only shortened the text, and El-Hulu displaces the original, often misogynist and patriarchal dialogue with witty, sardonic, and negative feminist messages. She writes, and I quote, "The aim is to recycle women-hating garbage into feminist art. Please feel free to use these comics, share them to start a debate, to understand the concept more elaborately, to question your privilege, or even to give them a constructive critique." Yeah, that's Maya. Okay, so here are a few examples that can be found on the webpage. And often an English translation of the Arabic text is included as a caption, as well as a longer message, usually in the form of a rant. That further distills the issue at hand is also beneath the image. And this is another, not yet. Okay. Kharabish Nasawiya addresses ongoing and pressing social issues in the Arab world that affect the everyday realities of women. Toxic masculinity, patriarchy, sexism, colorism, microaggressions, harassment, the list is long, as well as issues that affect all genders, such as mental health issues, poor road infrastructures, and regional issues. And this is a recent example. Other recent posts respond to the social media campaign Me Too and the controversial events in Egypt following Mashru' Layla's concert. Yeah, you can also see that, like, usually comments like this are abundant on this page, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But yes, she made a few posts one post following the events in Egypt after Mashru' Layla's concert, where several concert goers were arrested for carrying LGBT symbols. And this is from the Me Too response. In a description of her work, El-Hulu writes that the comics aim to expel from my body the patriarchal venom I am injected with every day. And also then again in the comments, more injections, always. In this paper, I examine the significance of Kharabish within its political and cultural context, tracing reactions, sharing patterns, and exploring how its circulation opens up meaningful spaces of encounter and exchange. A close reading of this project will also allow me to consider a range of broader questions, such as in what ways has the rise of comics, graphic novels, and other means of visual expressions following the popular uprisings intersected with ongoing feminist issues? What are the measures of effectiveness, concerning feminist meme production and political cartoons, how can humor, anger, and killing joy in popular culture function as a form of political resistance against heteronormative and hegemonic structures in the Arab world? Sorry, this is okay. I consider al-Hulus disruption and appropriation of pre-existing visual artifacts as an act of culture jamming, a term that was introduced into the mainstream through Mark Derry's review of guerrilla artists in his 1990 New York Times article, The Merry Pranksters and the Art of the Hoax, as well as his subsequent influential essay from 1993, Culture Jamming, Hacking, Slashing, Sniping in the Empire of Signs. Through his analysis of media hoaxing, billboard banditry, and guerrilla activism that expose corporate power, Derry describes culture jamming as artistic terrorism directed against the information society in which we live. Although Derry's analysis was describing specific regional and media shifts in the early 1990s, it remains relevant to culture jamming practices today. And in her formative book, No Logo, Naomi Klein also talks about this at length, and she argues that culture jamming is witnessing a rebirth because newly accessible technologies have made both the creation and circulation of ad parodies immeasurably easier. In the past 10 years, artists and activists have appropriated and disrupted cultural symbols in ways that have departed immeasurably from earlier jams that were temporally and regionally specific, such as ad busting, use of spray paint, and photocopying. One notable and recent instance of culture jamming occurred when street artists Hiba Amin, Karam Kapp, and Don Stone hacked the American series Homeland with subversive graffiti. And Homeland is a popular... does everyone know about this incident? Homeland is a popular American series, and they hired artists to add authenticity to a set that was meant to be a Syrian refugee camp, and they shot it in an abandoned chemical factory in Berlin, and they asked them to paint things that were like, nationalistic and whatnot. But when Hiba and the artists realized that no one actually knew what the hell they were doing, they hacked the set with their own graffiti. So this is one of the images, Mafish Homeland. And this aired on TV, so the directors didn't know what was happening. It just, it came on TV, so it was pretty brilliant. الوطن بطيخ. So this is what would be considered epic culture jamming. But what constitutes as culture jamming? How does the project of Kharabish Nasawiya differ from any meme, post, or GIF found on the internet? And what makes Kharabish Nasawiya a noteworthy project at this present moment? In a recent anthology published titled Culture Jamming, Activism, and the Art of Cultural Resistance, editors Marlon Delaure and Moritz Fink delineate key culture jamming tactics and interventions. This is a list. Culture jamming appropriates, is artful, playful, anonymous, participatory, political, transgressive, operates serially, and traverses national boundaries. And indeed, Kharabish Nasawiya does all of these things and beyond. It appropriates existing materials found on the internet, works contested notions into playful images using both humor and negativity to disrupt normative imagery. It is mostly anonymous. I didn't know if I should introduce you or not right now. Is released periodically, receiving hundreds of shares for each post throughout a multinational milieu, as evidenced by the comments, often starting contentious dialogues. I argue that by presenting intersectional feminist and social justice issues in Arabic through a highly accessible and shareable platform such as Facebook, Kharabish Nasawiya offers a meaningful feminist intervention by using Arabic language comics in a way that not only publicly presents, but also generates feminist discourse between users. The project hence provides a site of civic engagement. And these are some of the examples. So this is a recent... This she made in response to the Mashru' Layla events. And so I want you to look at the comments, actually, by Abdul Wahab Ahmed. So he starts this argument. And what is interesting is that Kharabish answers Abdul Wahab. And then Abdul Wahab retracts his like initial thing, and he says that I might have had false assumptions. But then also other people like chime in, and they add to this dialogue, and it's like unfolding, constantly unfolding on the page. It's quite beautiful to witness till it becomes really toxic, but often it is very productive. This is another recent post. Then we have here in the next, wait, I'll let you read it first. So the Arabic says, man up, man. And then this guy, Omar, someone says, he's asking if we should adopt feminine attributes for masculinity. And again, there's like an ongoing dialogue, and Kharabish answers, he's like, what do you think what is feminine attributes? And he answers, but then at the end he kind of like concedes again. He's like, yeah, you're right. So I love this like act of just, letting Kharabish educate them. It is really an educational tool on Facebook. Sometimes it doesn't work. So this guy thinks that this image is sexist. And the Arabic basically says, behind every great man, and the woman says, can you help me translate this? Like what, since you wrote it, please.
Privilege that is shielded by patriarchal system rooted in the hierarchy of
Structural, yeah?
structural discrimination or sexism.
Okay. But he thinks it's sexist. And he explains why. He's like, the dude is ugly. Like, he really has an issue with the image, and then he goes on, and he's like, and the woman looks like she's badass, but the guy is ugly, and women are, sitting, doing nothing, and we're taking the dangerous jobs. So yeah, sometimes they don't really get it, but I think that's also a learning moment, like, for feminists to know when to sit down and not engage anymore, because you can't win it all. It is specifically the presence of the feminist killjoy and the negative affect it invokes that is truly significant in Kharabish Nasawiya. In these images, a heterosexual couple is often portrayed in dialogue in the typical style of American romance comics from the Cold War era. However, the dialogue is not focused on jealousy, shame, betrayal, etc., but on definitions of queerness, transphobia, commentary on white privilege, diet fads, consumerism, borders, women's health issues. Again, the list is this is not an exhaustive list. The women in these images are sarcastic, unapologetic, angry, and they talk back, refusing to conform. They are not happy. They kill joy. In her book, The Promise of Happiness, Sarah Ahmed reintroduced the term feminist killjoy to describe the negative space that feminism occupies in contemporary discourse. The feminist killjoy, she writes, spoils, and I quote, spoils the happiness of others. She is a spoilsport because she refuses to convene, to assemble, or to meet up over happiness. In the thick sociality of everyday spaces, feminists are thus attributed as the origin of the bad feeling, as the ones who ruin the atmosphere. Ahmed, as well as several theorists such as Anne Svetkovich, Eve Sedgwick, Heather Love, have all posited unhappiness, negativity, and anger as valuable registers that allow us to re-examine the feminist archive. Ahmed argues that through alternative histories of happiness, we are able to consider, quote, those who are banished from it, or those who enter this history only as troublemakers, dissenters, killers of joy. The figure of the feminist killjoy disturbs the fantasy of happiness, troubling the notion of happiness as a social ideal, pushing against the foil of the happy housewife. In her analysis, Ahmed writes that the happy housewife is a fantasy figure that erases the signs of labor under the sign of happiness. In Kharabish Nasawiya, Al-Hulu reverses the figure of the happy housewife within the very setting that promised happiness in the first place, the domestic sphere. In this image, for example, a man asks his partner, "So, what's cooking today?" In this voice. She answers, "A series of group discussions that challenges normative understanding of motherhood and care, acknowledging them as labor. Also ones that deconstruct the idea that a woman's natural place is in the kitchen. Not so light, you see. By thus imbuing the images with new meanings, she gestures towards the killjoy's ability, al-hulu gestures, towards the killjoy's ability to make room for possibility, for chance, to generate spaces that respond to hegemonic structures of power. The use of humor in these images provides an affective resonance with the viewer that, quote, articulates an unhappiness within happiness and allow us to follow the weave of unhappiness as a kind of unraveling of happiness and the threads of its appeal. By getting the joke, we acknowledge the pain. The conflicting iconography of these images, where Arabic dialogue is read against mostly white women, also allow us to reflect on the state of Arab feminism vis-à-vis Western feminism. And as Hilary Shute writes in Women Comics and the Risk of Representation, they provoke us to think about how women, as both looking and looked at subjects, to borrow Laura Mulvey's term, are situated in particular times, spaces, and histories. And to wrap up, in conclusion, feminist responses to social issues in the Arab world, in the Arab-speaking world and the Middle East have become increasingly visible and connected to myriad and mobile forms of popular culture, such as blogging, music videos, graphic novels, and webcomics. Within that context, culture jamming as a locus of resistance is especially suited to feminist interventions, where dominant visual narratives are subject to appropriation and restructuring, offering re-articulations of modes of existence in a broader feminist media ecology. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions, and we'll take the questions one by one.
My name is Garrett Rubin. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question, maybe both for scholar and artist, I'm not sure. But just to maybe dig into this idea, which I like very much, that these works and the platform serve as a space for civic engagement, and just thinking a bit about the practicalities. If I understand correctly, sometimes the English translation is also accompanied by English text that is not referenced in the images themselves. And so I just wonder, I'm just thinking about language dynamics and how that plays into the civic discourse that's unfolding. Would you say that it's prompting conversation mostly in English in the comments? Are we seeing conversation and discourse in both? And how might that affect the dynamics of these works as civic engagement?
Are we taking?
We'll go one
Yeah.
at a time.
Oh, one at a time? Okay.
One at a time?
Yeah.
So she want to answer that or just want to give it up?
I mean, do you want to?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You can take more, I guess.
Or that, sure.
Okay.
Let's just
Let me
answer the
answer
question
that.
because no one
Okay,
has
okay. That's a really interesting question. Thanks, Garrett. So we actually just talked about, like, I interviewed Hello and I asked her about, like, you know, the nuances of the Arabic dialect to begin with within the speech bubbles and how people are responding to that. And initially the project was in a Lebanese dialect, and it's now like moving towards a more like neutral Arabic that is, I guess, somewhere between Lebanese, Egyptian, and formal. But in terms of the translation, I mean, and it's it's evolving, so this also might change. But I think that the conversations are happening in both Arabic and English, or what we call like Arablish. Like there's English and Arabic mixed into it. So I think it is bilingual, definitely in that sense. But because a lot of this language is already maybe in our consciousness in English to begin with, there is this like labor of translating. So there is already someone translating these very specific terms into Arabic, and I think that is how it begins. Like by exposing ourselves to these comics, we will then hopefully have more of these conversations in Arabic once we learn the language. Yeah. Also have the artist here if you want to ask her any questions. That works too. Or I can just show you more images.
I'm more interested, thank you for the questions. I'm more interested in how perhaps comic is working within the traditional settings and how that is also getting merged up within the modern settings. Okay, for instance, how is comic practiced in the settings where you mostly do not have perhaps the usage of social media, and how is that changing the narrative or the discourse, or the feminist discourse, trying to tear down the stereotypes vis-a-vis how those who are using the social media and how it is also impacting on that. So, and is there any meeting point at that particular, within the particular settings?
Do you want to speak to that?
Thank you. I get really nervous from the mic. Okay, in regards to the size, there have been events, particularly in Cairo. Like we had the 3rd International Comics Festival, and it was done in the American University in Cairo in Tahrir. And especially during that event, we had the launching of very prominent female artists. Like we had Dua El Adl, and Dua El Adl, she got recently published a book about 50 images of women. It's called 50 رسمة للست, and it basically talks about all issues that relates to women. Another thing we had another initiative of the latest publication of Dina Muhammad. Dina Muhammad is the comic creator of Qahira, and Qahira is the first online comic that came in Cairo, particularly to address the misconception about Islam, particularly for women. And this is when we see in Qahira is that she created this superhero who is veiled. And then there is a very young artist who's coming up. She does, but it's very minimal, and it relates now to children, basically children, and she is called Farah al-Shafai. In regards to the audience of the comics, it depends. Are you talking about online comics, or you're talking about comic printed magazines? So for instance, in both El Shekmagiyya and Tuk Tuk, they reframed their distribution strategies inside the bookstores and the outlets that they were using in order to have more access to the audience. Another thing that was done by El Shekmagiyya is that they used the online platform of Kutubna. And this is an online platform where you can purchase the magazine and download it on your laptop. I think, does this answer your question? I hope so.
Yeah, I guess I could. I mean, it's a great question, and it definitely begs the issue of privilege of access and who has access to social media. Like we often say that social media is so accessible, but yeah, many people don't have access to the internet. Many people can't, or don't have time, or aren't on Facebook, etc., etc. So, I mean, it's definitely an issue when we're thinking about structural issues within class and working relations. But I think that as it's only the project of Kharabish Nasawi is only a year old, so I think hopefully it will move in the direction of Tuk Tuk and other publications who have print, and maybe I'm hoping that someone is just going to take the comments and the images and stencil it on a wall. So
can I add something?
Any takers?
There are a number, there is a very new magazine that came in Egypt. It's called Ana wa Ana. And this is done by someone called Rania Amin, and she talks about particular issues that take place in the households, particularly between wives and husbands. Unfortunately, the book is the comic itself. It's a comic printed magazine. It's very good. However, it's not distributed across Cairo, even Cairo, within the districts of Cairo.
and if they've been trying to do something online in order for this magazine to go viral.
I guess I'm like going. I'm sorry, I did it. It's alright. I guess, yeah, following up on your question. I think a lot of it is not so much that people don't have the access. I mean, in so many parts of the world, like the internet is Facebook, but the issue that it is an echo chamber, or that these images reach people who already agree with what they say. So I guess this would be a question for the artist and for you as well. If there's been any analysis to what extent it actually has created more, discussion and discourse rather than it being something we see and like, yeah, we agree. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I think, and I'm sure Maya can add to that, but I think that by just simply looking at the comics, at the comments, you can see that there are people who arrive thinking that this is, that the echo chamber is there, but then through the comments and the engagement, it seems that the people are open to even changing their minds. I mean, it's not going to happen across the board, obviously, but I think through this kind of social interaction, it definitely is a possibility.
I'm really sorry for just coming in a little bit late. I'm just looking around the room and everybody looks a lot younger than me. So I'm wondering, is age an issue when you're circulating these resistances? How does that fit in? Because I'm not on Facebook or Instagram, so I don't know if you are.
Do you have a follow-up to that?
I actually have a follow-up on the previous question.
Okay.
Or do you want me to answer after?
No, go ahead.
I just want to say, and I'm not a graphic novelist at all, but I'm thinking about your question, and I think that the fact that in graphic novels or in comics such as these, I think it actually is a very good way of reaching people, because you're using visuals as well, which everyone, especially recently, especially people with access to the internet, and especially the younger generation, they're actually very receptive to it. And much like our research would only circulate and get recycled in certain academic settings, I think that's one way of actually, getting out of that circle. And so when other people, let's say, when some people are very resistant to reading a feminist article because it is a very scary thing to read, they'll be much more, ready to read something like this, and I think that's the genius of it, is that, we've all seen those graphics before, but there is some new stimulus in there, and it's Arabic, it doesn't fit, and so I want to read it. And so I think that's why, there's a lot of success in there, and that's why a lot of people share it. Kind of penetrating that sphere without them knowing.
Can I ask you to, I'm not sure I quite got what you meant by the age. Are you talking about age in the comics themselves, the representation of age, or?
No, who is doing it? Is it young people?
Who's doing the project?
How are you going to, create meaning and commitment, over the age cycle? I mean, is this just young people, or is it trying to incorporate everybody?
It's a single person project,
Yeah.
and the artist is right here.
I think you mean just in terms of
But I'm not.
circulation,
I still.
the audience.
Okay,
I-
so
I don't know why I'm blanking. I don't get the question still. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm taking space.
No. Please do.
So the audience are actually between 18 and 60, according to the Facebook. So I mean, I think this is a fair range. Maybe much older also would be good, and I don't know how would I reach them, but yeah. As for your question about is there discursive change happening? I feel like I'm very uncomfortable with measuring that, because I feel this is so UN, so funded. This is for me, this is not didactic. What I mean to do in it is just for women to relate, because I'd love to see things I can relate to, in the social, in the wider public, that given how much things we cannot relate to, that is shoved in our faces constantly and repetitively. So this is all I mean to do in this project, basically. Not all of it, but mainly. So no, I don't find that I have, or anybody can, have this discourse of like, I want to teach people. I find this very like superior, and it is imposed on us also by whiteness a lot, like by colonialism, this idea that we need to teach people. Who are we to teach people about anything? We just share knowledge. We share our knowledge and we take, knowledge from other comrades and so on. So this would be my answer. Thank you.
Two questions. I also want to say that people are circulating the images, not just, it's mostly on Facebook, but a lot of people are circulating it on Twitter, on WhatsApp channels. Arabs love to do that, so it's kind of all over like groups. So I think it is like expanding beyond the Facebook page and hopefully the internet per se. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Opa Ali. I was just wondering, for also the other conference and this conference, we have been like, I have heard of Tunis and Egypt a lot. So I have been wondering what happened to the other Arab countries, because I know like the Arab Spring have been was started by Tunis and like went like that. So what is with Egypt and Tunisia, like those countries? Are they like the heart of enlightenment? Why are we not talking about Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, all of those other Arab countries? And why? Oh my God, I'm sorry. And why the feminist idea are like starting from these countries? Because mainly, even those people that we talked about today are like mainly from those countries, Egypt and even Kharbish was started, I think, in Cairo. Because I attended your conference the other day in gender and sexuality.
Actually, comics are very prominent, particularly in Palestine. And a very prominent one is Joe Sacco Palestine. And he talks about Palestinian resistance. So the comics, there are emerging comics. And actually, the two most famous ones that the comics are really produced in are Palestine and Jordan. And Jordan, there is a very famous prominent book about a Jordanian girl who shares her everyday stories on the streets of Jordan. So actually, the comic scholarship or the comic study field is not only focused in Lebanon, nor in Cairo, nor in Egypt. It's actually very, very, very famous in Palestine. And particularly the comics that talks about politics and resistance and the Palestinian resistance to the Israelis. What was the second? The Gulf. I'm not very familiar with the Gulf. However, what I can assure you is that there has been a new trend emerging about Salafi comics, which is very entertaining and is very different. However, it is not accessible. So you can only access these Salafi comics if you're doing like primary research and if actually the people who are creating these Salafi comics are actually willing to talk to you. So I hope this answers the question. Can you give me 5 minutes? I don't recall the name.
That's a great question, and I think we're like limited by time also. So most of us, because like the field is not emerging, but there's not a lot of scholarship done. So we do want to focus on specific case studies. But I personally have written about comics from the Gulf. They're online. I can send you links. But we can't really cover the whole, it's a huge, the Arab-speaking world is quite large, and I just think in terms of logistics, like time won't allow. But yeah, there's definitely a lot out there. And I want to see that Jordanian thing too.
train today.
Okay.
Another thing, particularly like for Saudi Arabia, like the newest comics that came viral was actually about the right for women for driving, the driving license. So this is the most recent thing that has took place inside Saudi Arabia.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful questions and comments, and thank you to our panelists.